Hi, welcome to another Sydney Queer Muslims podcast session. My name is Nafia. I'm the social worker for this organization, and today we'll be chatting with Siobhan and Kerry, both queer Muslim reverts. Being a revert comes with a journey of exploration, fulfillment, and a sense of identity. Today's podcast will give us some insight on the perspective of a queer revert's experience with finding Islam. Welcome, Siobhan and Carrie. Thank you for joining us today to share your experiences of being queer Muslim reverts. To get things started, we would love for you both to introduce yourselves. Siobhan, if you would like to go first.
Sure. My name's Siobhan. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm bisexual. Wow, what goes into an introduction? I'm a volunteer wildlife rescue rehabber. That's
Oh,
kind of cool.
yeah.
And I'm also an anthropologist, so I study culture and how people use culture in their interactions with others. I'm a lecturer at UTS, and I've been with SQM since the beginning.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Thank you. Been busy.
Yeah, absolutely. Carrie, how about you?
Yeah, hello. My name's Kerry. My pronouns are she, her. I am a trans woman and bisexual also. I am studying psychology at the University of Western Sydney,
Nice.
potentially with a view to doing music therapy. And I also work as a healthcare worker at RPA. And I've been with SQM since, I suppose late last year. Was the first time I got in touch with everybody, and yeah, um, I'm thrilled to to be on this podcast.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for joining us and introducing yourselves. I guess to start off, maybe we can get into the point in your lives when you began to look into Islam and I guess what drew you into it. Siobhan, would you like to go first?
Sure. I found Islam when I was in late high school. So I was probably about maybe 16, 17 years old. And 9/11 happened, and I was
Um,
living in Southern California.
oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, that was an interesting time and an interesting place. And basically, I like Southern California is very multicultural. And
Mm,
I had many South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Arab classmates who were Muslim. And I never really thought much about their religion before 9/11. Then it happened all of a sudden, as America turned really Islamophobic. And I
mm,
started to ask questions like, well, these people are the same people that they were on September 10th. So
yeah.
what is it about their religion that has got people all in a tiz? So I just started to read. Now, at the time, my family was fundamentalist Christian. Well, not at the time, unfortunately, they still are. And this didn't jive with me, right? Christianity felt very colonial and repressive. But one really good thing that this kind of Christian background taught me was how to approach the study of holy books. So I started to read everything that I could get my hands on, and I just really loved the freedom of Islam. So that's what kind of made me start to look into it was that context of 9/11 and asking lots of questions.
Wow, okay. That's an interesting way to look at it. And especially coming from, would you say your parents were quite religious?
Oh, massively religious.
Right, right. Wow. So coming from quite a like a different background, I guess was it quite like foreign or were some of the concepts similar? How did you feel looking into the different, I guess, the different perspectives that Islam would have compared to what your family believed in?
Well, there's lots of different like Islamic perspectives to think about. There's the perspective of what like the mainstream media would have me believe that Islam was. There was
Mm,
the perspective of my friends, most of whom weren't massively religious. There was the perspective of who I might meet, if I went to go speak to people at local Islamic centers, which I did,
Mm.
that was interesting. And then there's the perspective that I started to come to as I read and put all these pieces together. So I think I was very lucky in that I learned fairly early on that what Islam looks like or what it is or what it means really depends on who you ask.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. There's so many different viewpoints of Islam according to the person you ask. So, yeah, it's I'm guessing you gathered quite a lot of different opinions and I guess came to a conclusion on your own.
Yeah, and I feel very I think another privilege that I had was I was quite isolated when I was a teenager. Like I mentioned, my parents were really repressive and I wasn't really allowed to socialize outside of school.
Um,
So I spent a lot of time alone with books, and this meant that I could read before I spent too much time speaking with people who represented themselves as religious Muslims. So, like I said, I had friends in school, I had classmates who were Muslim, but religion was not a huge deal to them.
mm,
Um, and by the time I actually went kind of searching for Muslims who were very actively religious, I already had a pretty good basis in reading. So I already had enough understanding to realize, oh, okay, well, like you only think this way because you've been brought up in a particular area, or you're from a particular social
mm.
class, or you have a particular educational level. And it was really handy for me to have that kind of background so I couldn't get sucked into a lot of the prejudices at the time or the assumptions that, oh, Muslims are all massively homophobic or Muslims are all this or that. It felt good to have a little bit of balance.
Yeah, absolutely. That would have been a really good starting point to have like a solid foundation
Yeah, it's a
of
real shame that I had to have the solid foundation because my parents kind of kept me in a box, but it was useful for that.
yeah. What about you, Carrie? Um, at what point in your life did you begin to look into Islam and what drew you to it?
Well, I suppose it was almost a pretty similar context, just in the
Mhm.
sense that I was quite young when 9/11 happened, and so I'd grown up with a lot of sort of obviously not as severe as in America, but actually not
Mm.
that different, really. Growing up in Australia, there was like this sort of background radiation, if you like, of Islamophobia
Yeah.
throughout, most of my primary school and high school life. And, despite growing up in a very multicultural area, I didn't have a lot of direct contact with Muslims. And so I had no kind of, although I knew, rationally that a lot of the kind of vitriol and a lot of the like polemic against Islam was completely overblown. I also didn't really
Mm.
have any kind of counter examples to kind of bolster that feeling that this was all a very politicized and false view of Islam. So I think as I got older, I wanted to seek that out. And
Mm.
so yeah, I did always have I guess like an academic kind of interest in Islam and in other religions as well. But I think
Mm.
particularly
Okay.
knowing how much I'd sort of been misled about, and all of us,
Yeah.
have been misled about Islam. And I think also growing up in a nominally secular but very culturally Christian kind of society. I mean, my parents, like my mum is a lapsed Catholic, and my dad has never really had any time for religion at all. So I didn't grow up in that kind of religious environment, but
Mm.
having that sort of this strange combination of a society built on or built over the top of a pre-existing society with a foundation of Christian ideals and Christian culture, but then also having a lot of that the faith aspects and a lot of the I guess the religious feeling and religious
Mhm.
conviction that informed that society kind of being
Yeah.
removed. It feels like, yeah, I grew up with a lot of cynicism around religion, and then also feeling like there was something missing in my life. I think there was something that I couldn't get without faith, or some
Yeah.
kind of belief system. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's something about the relationship that a lot of us have to Christianity growing up in the West, where it's just sort of, it's there and we don't really have any particular connection to it. And
Mhm.
as a result, we're quite closed off from faith. And as a result, I think it's sometimes difficult for us to approach other systems of belief and faiths that are felt quite deeply and expressed quite powerfully, and simply just, you know, expressed quite naturally, I guess. And so I think I wanted to understand that as well, in a way. Like, what is it like to have a connection to faith that isn't kind of just default, or that doesn't feel kind of
Oh, I see. Yeah.
unconsidered, I guess. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
So I guess what you didn't, I mean, obviously since you're a revert now, what you felt was missing in Christianity, um, you felt like you had found something in Islam?
I think, yeah, I think part of it was simply just like a strength of belief. I think I hadn't known a lot of devout Christians growing up, and I
Mhm.
think that the ones I did, it felt I don't know, I don't know how much of a role it played in their lives, I suppose. And whereas I think I guess I wanted to feel like I had kind of almost a center of gravity. I wanted to feel like I had a point of reference from which I
Right.
could, um,
Mhm.
a source that I could draw from, I guess. And I think um, in Islam, like so much of what I experience when I read about Islam is this sort of like returning to a center. Like, it feels like almost kind of an expression of tawhid in a way, right? Like this idea of returning to this kind of singular purpose, vision, that I think, yeah, it helps to ground you. And I think like a lot of people feel very kind of aimless, and um, you know, I think for me, Islam felt like a place to come home to. I guess, there's a lot of reasons why we use the term revert rather than convert. And I think for
Mhm.
me, it did feel like I was returning home, in a sense that I was finding a faith that I'd never really had in the first place, but something that I felt was missing in the first place. So I guess I can't also discount that when I was maybe like 12 or 13, my dad picked up a DVD of Cat Stevens playing live. And
Um,
I thought, oh, this is great. This is incredible. And it turned out it was the last concert he'd ever played before he um, sort of temporarily left music and converted to Islam. And it was like there were all of these interviews with him about the process and like how he found um, Islam. And hearing about that, I guess that was my first experience hearing about somebody, particularly, and the fact that it was a revert, like the first experience I'd had with somebody speaking openly, I guess, about their faith and what a positive and powerful experience it had been for them. And I guess that might have also been like a kind of a catalyzing effect for me.
wow, thank you for sharing that. Honestly, I have to agree with how you feel about Islam, like kind of returning home. I myself was born as a Muslim, but I felt like a lot of the, I guess, teachings and perspectives, I wasn't really taught that much about it. I was kind of taught more about what's wrong and what's right. But the more I did my own research into it, I started to gain direction and a sense of, like you mentioned, a sense of returning home. So what you just mentioned, like that really resonated with me. So yeah, how you described it was beautiful as well.
Oh, thank you.
Wow. Okay. So both of you come from, I guess, almost similar backgrounds. And I guess while searching Islam, what were the concepts that resonated with you? And were there some that were initially quite foreign to what you were raised with? Siobhan, did you want to go first?
Sure. Oh, well, when I was doing all that reading that I told you about, I
Mm-hmm.
came across this Sufi concept, Wadat ul Wujud, the unity of being. And I that really it really caught my attention. And but I didn't read just one kind of Sufism. I also read a Shia text that's called The Kernel of the Kernel,
Mm-hmm.
which is an authoritative work on Sufism from a Shia perspective. And in it, I learned about the viewpoint that we as people are only parts of this much larger whole, right? The entire universe. Some people call this whole God. Others say the material world can't be God, but only continues to exist by God's grace. Like, I don't get caught up in the fine details of theology, but I find them really interesting to think about. Either way, I appreciated this viewpoint that everything is connected in the same way that everything, even within my own body, is connected, right? So, according to this perspective, our job as human beings is basically not to become a cancer. Don't be a disease. It's to work in harmony with not just the other people around us, but also the natural world. And this is pretty much what my ancestors believed also. So, this worldview, like to kind of echo Carrie's point, it really felt like coming home for me as well, but on lots of different levels. As for what felt foreign, well, nothing really felt foreign as such. Maybe some of the ambiguity, perhaps. For example, just to illustrate, I did my master's thesis on Islamic environmentalism, and I remember reading in Muhammad Asad's translation of the Quran that the concept of amanah referred to the natural environment, that the planet was the trust that mankind had to safeguard.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I read elsewhere in a different translation that amanah referred to free will, and you'll get other explanations of it elsewhere as well. So this idea that something as simple as a word meaning trust could have so many different interpretations was really foreign to me, right? Coming from this massively Christian background where everything was very solid and sure, this idea that, something couldn't be solid and sure, that there wasn't some like old white man in a suit somewhere who preached one interpretation that was the interpretation and didn't leave any room for others, having a kind of religious framework where there wasn't something like that, there wasn't that level of certainty, that was quite foreign to me. And of the things that I loved most about Islam, was probably one of the things that was the most foreign, that there is no central religious authority, that there is no old man in a beard who has the right to tell me what God really means or who God is or what God thinks, because like nobody can know.
Yeah.
Nobody knows the mind of God. And I see this as very liberating, not liberating in the sense that I can now do whatever I want, but liberating in the sense that everyone needs to walk with humility because nobody can ever know anything for sure. We're all just figuring this out. So, because of this uncertainty, we need to use our reasoning and our intellect. And what's more Islamic than that, right? That is straight up Quranic responsibility. There are so many different ayahs in the Quran that talk about the need to use your brain. And I just found this really, really attractive. It really resonated with me.
Oh, wow. So it was quite freeing, you would say?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Yep. Okay. What about you, Carrie? What were there any concepts that resonated with you before you became a revert? And were there anything that was initially quite foreign when you did your research?
I think, similarly to Siobhan, I think a lot of the things that seemed foreign to me were also the things that were the most appealing to me, or the things that
Hmm.
resonated the most with me. I think,
Hmm.
in particular, I had always, had an interest in Islam, and I came to Islam quite with a lot more like fervor at a time when I was feeling very, disenfranchised. I think
Mhm.
um, I've always been quite cynical about, growing up in a very individualistic kind of society, and kind of, watching in real time how communities and the idea of communalism in general kind of becoming like eroding over time, and an impact that's had on uh, all of our well-beings. And this is even before we were all forced to stay inside for a year.
Yeah.
It's been a long and uh, degrading process, and so I think learning about more communal
Mhm.
cultures in general,
Mm.
uh, it's I think it's always going to be something that kind of maybe feels quite foreign. I mean, it's a fundamentally different approach to how the world works and how society works and how you
Mm.
relate to other people.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it felt like such a like it seems so obvious, the idea that we belong to each other to some degree and that we are all dependent on each other, and that we can't exist as individuals. We exist relationally. And I think um, learning about the responsibility that we have to each other um, within the context of Islam was a very, um, I think it spoke a lot to me as, once again, something that I felt I was missing.
Mhm.
And I think the idea of community, of the Ummah, was such a powerful and resonant concept. And the, um, the flattening of hierarchies involved in that. Obviously, this is not always the case, but the idea that we are all, as Muslims, we are all members of the same community. We all
Mhm.
coexist and correlate to each other, and I think that's something that we often forget. Living in Australia, that we
Yeah.
to each other, and so yeah, that was something that really spoke to me. And I guess related to the idea of like individualism is, that idea of personal freedom is something that we grow up kind of internalizing. The idea that your individual rights and your individual freedoms are the most important thing.
Mhm.
And I think one concept that really kind of knocked me flat when I read about it was this concept of um, aqidah, like the idea that every um, every animal, every plant, every living and non-living thing in the world, it does not have free will. It has a predetermined path that it will follow from
Yes.
the
Yeah.
beginning to the end. And the thing is that we too have this
Yeah.
path, which I guess relates to the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. We also have this predetermined path
Mhm.
that we are set to walk, but we also have the free will to choose our own path. And I think one aspect of faith and of Islam that was really resonant to me was the idea that you have this free will, you have this freedom to do whatever you want, and that to some extent you must kind of choose regardless of your free will to follow the path that is laid before you, not in the sense that not in the kind of like prescriptive this is right and this is wrong kind of way, but more in
Mhm.
the sense that you are deliberately choosing to sublimate your personal freedoms for the sake of a higher purpose. And part of that is how you relate to other people, and part of it is your relationship to God and to the world around you. And I think the idea of just um, there was a there's a song I used to listen to a lot
Mhm.
when I was still kind of looking around for something to hold on to. I think it was called Wealth by this band called Talk Talk, and one of the lyrics is "Take my freedom for giving me sacred love," and it's this song that it feels like it's searching for a faith and for a purpose as well. And so for me, that idea of like, I will offer up my personal freedom, my personal individual freedom, if you will give me a higher purpose and a love and a community, you know,
Yeah.
and a collective responsibility. So I think, yeah, that was a concept that was very kind of difficult to reconcile, I guess, with the kind of society that I'm growing up in
Yeah.
and living in now. But also, what a beautiful idea that you are part of a greater whole, and that you have a responsibility to yourself, to your body, to the people around you, to the world as a whole. And yeah, I think it's a beautiful idea that was very kind of revelatory for me, I think.
Okay, guys. So I guess what made you decide to finally commit to Islam? What was kind of, were there a lot of different reasons, or was there one main reason that really, I guess, was the turning point in your journey?
Shall I start us off?
Ah, yes, please.
Okay. Islam provides a framework to spirituality that I can get behind. That's the short version. That's the abridged version. You see, I'm not a fan of organized religion. I never have been. But Islam isn't really an organized religion. There are, of course, canonical sources of Islam. There's the Quran, there's the Sunnah. There are people who have knowledge of both. They're a resource. But ultimately, it's up to you. What your Islam will look like will depend a lot on you and who you are. And I kind of felt this from the beginning, right? Even as I was a teenager reading the Quran and what have you. But I learned the words to really articulate it from an uncle I met at the Keramat Sultan Iskandar Shah on Fort Canning Hill in Singapore. And that's said to be the burial place of one of the last kings of Singapore. It's a really peaceful place, and people go there to think or meditate or pray. And one day I was there, and an elderly man spoke to me about Islam. And as soon as this poor guy opened his mouth, I was already getting ready for a fight because I was just so used to being policed by old men in beards. But he didn't. He just wanted to share that from his perspective, he saw the Quran as being like a mirror. So if someone reads it with a good, peaceful heart, then their Islam will be peaceful and loving. But if someone reads it with a hard or a hateful heart, then their Islam will be harsh and hateful likewise. It's a very simple message, but it's one that really stuck with me. Islam gives freedom. So what people call Islam can look radically different depending on who you ask. So you asked about my commitment. I think my commitment to Islam was based on this realization on factors very similar to what Carrie already articulated, with kind of seeing yourself as part of this larger whole and having responsibilities to things beyond yourself. So that gives purpose and meaning, which I think many people need, like feel a deep need for, and I do as well. But my decision to commit to Islam was also based on the acceptance that I would probably be a bad Muslim, but that didn't mean that I was a non-Muslim, right? I miss a lot of prayers. I sometimes pay instead of fast because I have the means to do so, and I really struggle with not eating. I fail. I fail a lot. I sometimes fail spectacularly, but I take comfort in the fact that, this is actually okay. Christianity taught me guilt, but
Right.
I think Islam taught me acceptance. So I'm not a good Muslim, but I'm Muslim. I might miss prayers, but I can do other things like show my kindness through charity or through caring for orphaned, injured, or sick animals like I do on the regular. So that level of acceptance and that level of feeling that, you know what, even though I might be a spectacular disaster sometimes, I'm still enough. It's okay. That meant a lot to me.
Wow. I'm honestly, I'm actually learning quite a bit myself through this podcast. Um, Okay, what about you, Kerry?
Well, I actually hearing Siobhan talk about the idea of being, learning guilt from Christianity and learning acceptance from Islam, that actually just reminded me of something. I remember reading about the story of uh, Adam and Eve
Hmm.
leaving the garden after eating the apple. It's a story that everybody kind of grows up hearing about. Regardless of
Yeah.
how religious they are, it's just sort of one of those things that kind of you learn through osmosis. And the moral of that story has always been the idea of original sin. You know, they were cast out because they committed this grievous sin, and so they were denied Eden. And when I learned about the Islamic interpretation of that story, the idea that that the story didn't end there.
Hmm.
Adam repented. He prayed to God, and he was forgiven, and that's the moral. Like, it isn't the sin. It isn't the sin that lives on and must be paid for on behalf of all people. It's a sin that was committed and that was
Yeah.
owned up to and forgiven, and that was the end. That was open shut case. I think that speaks a lot to what also, yeah,
Hmm.
drew me to Islam. The idea of, yeah, you can fail and you will, like
Hmm.
you can fall and get up, and it's okay. We're all just doing our best, and I think, yeah, that was something else that really drew me to Islam. As far as what drove me to finally commit to Islam, I suppose all of these things have been floating around for me. The idea of wanting to unlearn a lot of things about
Hmm.
Islam, the idea of understanding a culture and embracing a faith, and finding a kind of a focal point, a center of gravity, and the idea of being drawn to communal life, living for and with other people, and not
Mm,
seeing
yeah.
yourself as an individual. All of these things were like floating around, and I guess maybe they needed kind of a focal point to direct themselves to. And I think for me that was it was Palestine. It was,
Oh.
I'd always, like, again, I'd always been supportive of Palestine. I guess,
Hmm.
like, in a kind of abstract, that's happening over there kind of way, and then suddenly you see, the extent of the destruction and violence
Yeah.
and cruelty, and
Yeah.
on on the other side of that, the steadfastness, the sumud, the resistance, passive or active. um,
Yeah.
I think in that kind of context, they're one and the same. Any active resistance is defiant and powerful, and I think seeing footage of men who'd lost their entire families, who were holding their infants in their arms, and saying Allah alone is sufficient.
Yeah.
I think it's the kind of thing where I think if you hear a lot of people hear phrases like Allahu Akbar, and they have certain ideas of what that means, or they hear the word shahid or martyr and they have certain ideas of what that means, and then to see that in a context where I could let the words land and understand their meaning and their
Hmm.
intention, I think that's the kind of experience that you can't really resolve within yourself unless you make a big commitment or a big change, or you feel transformed, I think, in that moment. And for me, yeah, I the fact that I could understand this man and what it meant for him to profess his faith, and his steadfastness, in defiance of everything that had happened to him and to his family. I
Hmm.
think that was the moment where, well, it wasn't a decision. I was already there, and so. Yeah, I think after the first um the first big rally I went to, the first pro-Palestine rally I went to, I said the shahadah for the first time that night, and
Oh, wow.
yeah, I guess that was, yeah, that was really where it began, or where it ended in a way, and began again.
So you're both queer Muslims. So what were some of the struggles that you faced during your journey to Islam as a queer individual? And how did the people around you react to it? Siobhan?
Being bisexual meant that I didn't need to struggle to the same extent that queer Muslims raised in some Muslim families did. I could pass as straight, and I married a man really early. I was like 19, way too young.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 19 is, well, I won't speak to other people's experiences, but for me, that was a bad idea. And this maybe protected me somewhat.
Mhm.
However, my then husband, he was Muslim too, and he was quite queer phobic. And just to give you an idea, I remember him implying that my bisexuality was some kind of mental illness.
Oh, no.
I know, and I was just a bit confused. He tended not to bring Islam into it. He just spoke very matter-of-factly that homosexuality cannot possibly be normal or natural, and that
Mm,
it's definitely a result of the fact that I had a really traumatic childhood. Like, he
right.
totally believed my sexuality was a trauma response.
So, so you did, I guess you openly shared it with him, and um, obviously that would have been his response, but how did that conversation start? Did you decide to, I guess, come out to him? Was he the first one that you came out
Well,
to?
this was like a guy that 19-year-old me was in love with. And when
Mm,
you're in love with someone, like you want that person to know who you really are. So
exactly.
he wasn't the first person like came out to. Other people who were close to me knew about my sexuality. Like that wasn't really a secret, apart from my parents, of course.
Yeah.
But I left my parents' home like on my 18th birthday, which was like the earliest legal possibility I had
Yeah.
because they were in the
Yeah.
United States. So like that's how symbolic it was. My birthday, I was gone.
Oh,
Um, so yeah, I just wanted to share with him who I was, and I got shamed for it. But anyway, I feel like needless to say, I did not stay married to this person, and I
yeah.
definitely didn't have a kid with him because he also believed that having a child would be like the final cure and I would finally be straight. So that
Oh.
didn't happen, and I'm still not straight. I do. I do feel fortunate that even though I had to live with his shaming, right, it's not something I was exposed to early.
Yeah.
Uh, my mother was a little homophobic, but she died when I was 12, and I was sent to live with my father and his new wife in America. And because they were strangers to me, their massively offensive opinions didn't hurt all that much. Like
Um,
they were and still are very, very homophobic. We're no contact. I haven't spoken to either of them in about 20 years. But
oh, goodness. Wow. Okay.
yeah, we don't get on. Like I said, I left on my 18th birthday, right?
Yeah.
I already described how I was pretty tightly controlled as a young person, so dating anyone, male or female, was just out of the question. Uh,
Mm,
I was dropped off at school, I was collected from school, so I didn't have any opportunity to socialize basically outside of school.
right.
Um,
Yeah, that's definitely no way to live.
no, but you asked about Islam, right? So getting
Yeah.
back to Islam,
Yeah.
because I did so much reading, I discovered works by people like Abdel Wahad Boudaba, who wrote a book about sexuality in Islam. And knowing that there was a vibrant scholarly discussion about this helped me not worry too much. You see, there's no discussion that murder is bad in Islam, right? There's no discussion that stealing things that aren't you is bad. There's no discussion about this.
Yeah.
there are a lot of scholars who would have us believe that being gay is just as bad as those things. And
Hmm.
yet the Quran repeatedly tells us to use our reason and intellect. So how can loving someone in a way that hurts no one be bad? Well, it didn't make sense to me back then. Doesn't make
Hmm.
sense now. So I just didn't ever really worry about it. And then you can add to the fact that homosexuality in Islam is only really a big thing now. It's quite a recent fixation. There's a lot of queer history in Muslim societies, but I'll spare you the history lesson. If anyone's interested, I wrote a blog post about this topic a few years ago that I think is still available on the SQM website. I think
Oh,
it's
I
called
would like to read it.
yeah, I think it's called The Origins of Homophobia in the Muslim Community. I don't even remember why I wrote it. I think maybe Nurul asked, or maybe I read something and it pissed me off. Anyway, I wrote this. It's got lots of sources, and you can find interesting things to read in the references list if anyone's interested.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's also something that just kind of helped me not worry about this too much as a Muslim. Like, this is a very recent fixation.
Okay, wow. So I guess since you weren't in touch with your family, they, I guess you didn't really get a reaction from them, um, being a queer Muslim. But how was your support system, maybe with friends or others in the community? How was that like?
I've always had chosen family.
Ah,
So
yes.
I do keep in touch with some of my other relatives. It's really just my father and his wife that I have like no desire to have any relationship with because they're both just they were very, very abusive.
Ah,
But the rest of my family are okay. I think I confuse them equally with being Muslim, with being bisexual. I think that because they know, but they just see me as this kind of curiosity who lives in a very faraway country and a not just a life, but also a job that they don't quite understand. Like try to explain to your elderly relatives that you're an anthropologist and you're also a queer person and a Muslim. They're like, wait, like none of it makes sense. But they're not hostile or anything. They just think I'm peculiar, which I can live with. That's fine. I am peculiar.
and
But
that's
I've always had,
okay.
yeah, I've always had really good relationships with, I've always been blessed in being able to find support networks and find very good friendships.
Mhm. Yeah.
So my support base has always been chosen family.
And those relationships would be, I guess, quite strong and beneficial to how you're living your life now and your beliefs now, you would say?
Oh, absolutely. I would like to think that I'm a fairly well-adjusted person now. This would not have been possible without a lot of love and care over the years from lots of very, very different kinds of people.
Wow, it's very lucky.
Very lucky.
Yes. What about you, Carrie? What were some of the struggles you faced during your journey to Islam as a queer individual? And how was your support system? How did the people around you react to it?
Um, it was a very interesting kind of kind of process. I think for me, the most important process for me was just internal.
Mhm.
Where do I belong in this? I think I began transitioning like a good 5 years ago. And so I'd already gone through this process of, I guess, reintroducing myself and reintegrating myself into
Mhm.
society.
Yeah.
Um, and and never having a certain foothold, like never being quite sure, like, okay, how much do I belong and how am I perceived? So and my family and my friends had been very supportive. I guess the worst I could say about them was that they were maybe not sure what to do and like how to do the right thing by me, which is,
Ah, yeah.
not a huge complaint, it's just
Yeah.
figuring it out. It's all good. But so, it was more about like how I'm received by strangers on the street. And at the end of the day, you can't control that, so that doesn't matter. And so I'd gone through all of that, I guess, as a trans woman, dating another trans woman long term,
Hmm.
and now I have this um, kind of, I guess, epiphany of faith, and now it's like um, I don't want to equate the two entirely, but there's a lot of parallels. This idea of you are the same person,
Hmm.
but there is a pretty profound difference within you that has changed the way that you relate to the world and to other people. And um, it's this very strange kind of, you know, being trans or being Muslim. It's like, or becoming both. I guess it's like it's not a
Mm.
big deal, but it is a big deal. It's just I don't want people to think it's a big deal. I
Yeah.
want people to just be like, okay, cool, whatever. You might as
Yeah.
well tell me that you're right-handed. Cool. So I think for me it was like, well, how do I reconcile these things within myself first of all? And so immediately I sought out, what are what is the consensus? What is the debate around
Hmm.
queerness in Islam? And
Yeah.
like to Siobhan's point, the fact that there is discussion and debate kind of is already a good sign. And I found this one quote from Al-Qurtubi, like from one of his tafsirs. So like this is from 13th century. Um, you know, the idea that a lot of the terms in the Quran, as pertains
Hmm.
to gender, are binary because a lot of people wouldn't have come across intersex people or people who exist outside of the binary
Mm.
model in
Yeah.
7th century Arabia. And so
That's yeah.
it's a generalization, and that's something that happens all the time in language. It's like, you say men and women and you mean everyone else as well is kind of implied in that. And then apparently he had a colleague who was intersex, and he mentioned that he regretted never overcoming his shyness and asking them about it, which I think is very sweet. The idea of a 13th century Islamic scholar kind of being like, oh, it'd be rude to ask, but
Yeah.
like I'm kind of interested. This is interesting. So the fact that there are well-meaning, confused people as far back as um, as far back as Islam has existed,
Hmm.
frankly, I think that was a comfort to me. As far as like actually finding acceptance or you know finding tolerance, I guess yeah, it wasn't. I didn't come across a lot of difficulty,
Hmm.
um, which I'm very thankful for. I
Yeah.
guess maybe particularly between my partner and I, it created a lot of there were a lot of conversations to be had about what it means to be, an interfaith couple all of a sudden,
Yeah.
and the difficulties around that and how we navigate that. And that's like a conversation we'll have for the rest of our lives, I'm sure. But the fact that we're willing to have those conversations so openly, I think, is a pretty good sign. So I
Yeah,
think,
of
yeah,
course.
I've come across a lot of difficulties that just are kind of, I guess, the kinds of difficulties that just come naturally with this kind of process. And I'm so, so lucky and grateful that no added friction has come from people's
Mm.
preconceptions or people's sort of, weird ideas about, how queerness and religion can intersect. And,
Mhm.
I don't begrudge anybody those feelings. Maybe, I would if I actually had a first-hand experience. I'd maybe have a bit more of a chip on my shoulders. But like, um, I understand that this stuff is difficult, and even when your heart is open, it's difficult to reconcile these things. So I guess it's just an ongoing process. There are other aspects like I've never set foot in a masjid before. I've never prayed with anybody else. Oh,
Oh,
I have once.
really?
Um, but that was, at a SQM meetup. So, that was a moment where I could feel, integrated and empowered to express my faith openly in community. So I guess that was the other aspect of it. Is just like, well, I know that I can get over this. Like I can integrate this,
Mhm.
but I also need to find a community that gives me a good grounding for that. So that was, I guess, my first port of call was to like, okay, there are queer Muslims out there. I have to go and
Mhm.
find them. And I think that was the most important step for me. And I think that's part of why I haven't experienced a lot of difficulty outside of, the kind of standard stuff that comes with a big kind of lifestyle change. So I've been really, really fortunate in that regard.
Wow. So SQM, I guess. So that was your first experience praying with other Muslims?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and it was incredible. Yeah, just that feeling I don't know. I
Community?
just yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because it's like from my personal experiences, Islam feels like a very solitary and personal thing, and that's
Mhm.
beautiful in itself. But it's like, oh, yeah, this is why the Friday prayers happen. This is why people all come together like this because it isn't just you know you in a small like corner of your room that
Yeah,
you set
exactly.
aside. This is a big part of what it's about. And I think maybe, out of like caution or just shyness, like I think it's something that I haven't quite taken hold of yet. And
Mhm.
maybe that's part of why I haven't come across a lot of like difficult situations. But I think it's also probably, you know, withheld me from a lot of really positive experiences. So I do hope I can kind of open up a little bit more and be a part of that community that I'm already a part of.
I guess as reverts, what are the positives that keep you in the path of Islam, and how do you deal with the conflicting beliefs on being both queer and Muslim? Siobhan, did you want to go first?
Sure. I think, as I mentioned, Islam is really what you make it.
Hmm.
Islam is all about reflecting on the social and natural world that I live in and thinking about, well, what can I do to leave both in a better condition than I found them? And to me, that's what fitra is, right? That's being a force for harmony and good. There's no reason why you can't be queer and a force for good at the same time. And honestly, my response to anyone who insists that no, you can't be both, well, like haters gonna hate. I might be dating myself by saying that, but it's true, man. Haters are gonna hate. And there's
Yeah.
nothing that I can say that's gonna change certain people's minds. And so, like, it's okay. To you, your religion, and to me, mine. Even if we are both, identifying ourselves as Muslim,
Yeah.
obviously our Islam is very different.
Yeah.
And I don't see that there's any reason for me to like engage in that kind of conflict
Yeah.
or these clashes because I think that generally people learn much more from observing and they
Hmm.
learn more from example than they learn from somebody telling them, hey, you're wrong.
Yeah.
So I try not to do the whole, hey, you're wrong thing, and instead let the life that I lead be the example I want to leave in the world, right? You don't think you can be Muslim and queer? Well, like actually I'm both, and I'm very comfortable with that. And look at me, I exist. Isn't that
Exactly.
great? So I think that, not concerning yourself too much with what other people think is really
Mhm.
important.
Yeah, and it must be empowering as well.
Yes, yes, very much so. But I will also like there's a little caveat. I'm almost 40 years old. I'm 39. And I think that the older I get,
Hmm.
the less patience I have for other people's opinions of me.
Yeah.
I just straight up don't really care anymore. And I think that a lot of what looks like empowerment is actually just being old and tired and not having the energy to, yeah, bother myself too much with, people who are saying, oh, you're living an immoral life or you believe in immoral things or I think. Well, like it's kind of Islam is sort of between people and God and the world that they live in. And if you can keep those relationships right, I'm not going to concern myself too much with people who just want to stir the pot.
That's right. It's your own personal relationship with God and your own journey.
Yep.
And what about you, Carrie? what are the positives that keep you on the path of Islam, and how do you deal with possible conflicting beliefs on being queer and Muslim?
I think in the first, well, at first when I first reverted, I think there was a lot of insecurity around being a revert.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know how to pray. Like, what time am I supposed to fast from? What are the
Yeah.
how do I calculate zakat? Like, it's a lot of it is very uh, opaque, I guess, if it's
Yeah.
something that you haven't grown up in. And so for a long time, I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I wish that I'd grown up with this, so that I knew what I was doing. And then speaking to people who weren't reverts, they were like, like a lot of people who grew up Muslim are kind of jealous of reverts, because it's something that they've come to as opposed to something that they were raised in. And that
Yeah.
changed my perspective because I was like, okay, I understand that, if you grow up in a religious or a cultural practice, it feels very ingrained and it feels very internalized. And on the other hand, it's like, well, is this really what I believe? Is this really mine? Whereas,
Mhm.
like, I guess as a revert, I can stand up and say, yeah, this is mine. This is my faith. This is something that I've come to. And I think uh, both sides of that are true. I think what a wonderful thing to have been able to be brought up in Islam and to have such a close relationship with it for such a long time. And at the same time, what a beautiful thing to come to it later in life and to
Mhm.
feel like you're returning home and to um, I guess approach it with almost like a clean slate as well. To
Yeah.
define what that means for you. And I think that's been a very helpful thing for me navigating queerness and Islam at the same time. And I think, yeah, as I said earlier, like finding examples of queer Muslims, especially like, from way back in the day, the
Mhm.
idea that, yeah, it's not a new, it might be a new, you know, obsession for some
Mhm.
people, but it's certainly not a new concept within Islam. I think that's been very heartening. And I guess, yeah, I think about how so much of us is built on contradiction. I think we're all kind of trying to reconcile different conflicts that come from different aspects of ourselves. I think uh, part of being a person is just to just hold two truths about yourself that seem to be in conflict with each other and reconciling
Mm.
them because, well, they exist in me. How can they possibly be contradictory? And to accept them for what they are. I'm queer, I'm Muslim. Um, that is not a contradiction. That is not a. It's not even necessarily a strange thing.
Yeah.
It's not unheard of. We're out here, and so
Yeah.
I think, yeah, doing a lot of work on just holding these two things and examining them and knowing that they are true. Um, that's often enough for me to kind of reconcile any kind of concerns or any kind of insecurities I might have, um, as to how to reconcile those conflicts in other people. When they see me, I'm still figuring that out. I'm still collecting data on that. I guess I just again haven't had a lot of interactions that have forced me to reconsider how I reconcile those two things. And I mean, part of me hopes that I do, so that I get the opportunity to kind of um, to figure out, I guess, how I navigate difficult situations, to get that
Mm.
opportunity. It feels like a challenge that I almost want to set for myself, to know how I stand in my truth in that sense. And at the same time, yeah, I hope nobody is weird to me about this stuff because they don't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess, yeah, it's all still a learning process, and yeah, I guess it'll always be a learning process.
Yeah, definitely. I've actually gotten a lot of opinions from other people when they hear about SQM and they say, um, queer and Muslim, that exists. And, I have to say, yeah, like I'm one. We have a whole community of queer Muslims, and we exist. And it's often so jarring for others that don't, I guess, understand it. But at the same time, it's it is nice to know that SQM and I guess the more exposure that other people are getting to knowing that you can be Muslim and queer, it's bringing more awareness in others.
Also, gonna say, this is such a weird, I guess, one of the only things that I've experienced, in terms of like people kind of not knowing how to take me, I guess, like not knowing what to do with me,
Mhm.
is,
Yeah.
um, I am white and I'm a Muslim. That feels almost like, um, I guess, queerness is something that people can engage with or not engage with, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas like people have suddenly started to be very weird about how I relate to whiteness as a Muslim, which
Hmm.
is such a strange experience for me. I remember I was talking to two classmates at uni. One of whom was also Muslim, and we were talking about like it was my first Ramadan and stuff, and she was saying,
Hmm.
"Oh, I'm actually not fasting because I'm actually pregnant with my first child," and I was like, "Oh, amazing, mashallah," and we're all that, and the other person we were talking to was like, "Oh, I mean, congratulations!" Like, I mean, I'm too white to say that, and that just that blew my mind because, like, first of all, I've never met a Muslim in my life who wouldn't be happy to hear mashallah. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But also, what do you think I am? Like, what about like this person is like vaguely like Irish Italian, so am I. Like, what is what have I done to to earn the right to say mashallah that you it was such a strange experience, and I guess it's just like that is another kind of short circuit for people, which
Hmm.
I never really considered. Um, and yeah, it's sort of that is another, I guess, axis where I am now being kind of reintegrated into society as somebody who doesn't really fit into these two categories that have no reason not to be. I mean, you know, people from Bosnia and Albania, like, would you not call them white? And yet they're most likely Muslim. Like all of
Mm,
these weird preconceptions. And so that in itself is kind of another way of me to say, like, yeah, I mean, we can also be queer too. Like, who knows?
yeah.
Who knows? Just the level of misunderstanding and misconception about Islam is almost like an invitation, I guess, to be like, yeah, like let's really broaden your horizons here. Like, these are all of the ways that you can be Muslim and XYZ. Um, we're everywhere, we're everything. And, I think that's a really exciting thing to be able to bring to other people.
Mhm.
Just the idea of merely existing is a means of opening people's minds and
Yeah, very true.
expanding their horizons.
Very true. Thank you for sharing that. From the experiences that you've both gained up until now, what would you tell your past self while at the beginning of your journey to Islam? And is there anything you would tell other queer reverts in your position, Siobhan?
Hmm. First thing that pops into my head when you ask that question is I would tell myself that I didn't need to get married. I'm not even joking though. Like, I didn't need to get heterosexually married to be a real Muslim.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the motivations was that I needed to do that to be respectable. I had it in my mind that, marriage is half of your faith, and I wanted to feel complete. But looking back, I now know that being respectable is first off totally overrated, and
Hmm.
your spirituality isn't tied to who you live your life with. So I would take happy over respectable any day.
Hmm.
But this is maybe another one of those privileges of aging that I was talking about before.
Yeah.
I would also tell myself that it's perfectly fine to be a bad Muslim by popular measures, right? Like I was and still am doing the best I can, and
Mhm.
that's okay.
Yeah, that's right. You're trying your best, and that's what matters. What about you, Carrie? What would you tell your past self at the beginning of your journey to Islam? And is there anything you would tell other queer reverts in your position?
I think one of the biggest lessons I would want to impart on myself or to anybody else is just to take your time.
Hmm.
It's I think it did take me about a year to learn how to pray properly.
Yeah,
Um, and it's also just like how do you integrate that into your life, into your your schedule, and
yeah,
it's a big thing to kind of have to reorient, especially if you're the only Muslim in your household or in your
yeah, for
family.
sure.
It's a big change, and you should treat it as such. Like you shouldn't really go into anything expecting to have it down,
Yeah,
immediately
that's
to be able
right.
to do everything at once. And I guess it deserves that patience and that slow and considered approach. I think there's a term I heard about called convertitis, which I think it's particularly for new Muslim women. And particularly, they'll jump into Islam with both feet, and which is wonderful. It's great to be enthusiastic and to feel that. I remember feeling this rush of like euphoria, jumping into Islam and feeling, yeah, there's this sense of completion, and yet if you do that, you run the risk of, um, you know, taking in so much information, taking in so many
Mhm.
opinions and prescriptions of what you should and shouldn't do,
Yeah.
what you should and shouldn't wear, and um, all of these things are conversations you need to have with yourself over a
Mm.
long period of time. I am still like reflecting whether I want to start wearing hijab, and that's not something that I'm going to like, just jump into because you know, decide to do it on a whim. It's something that that changes how people look at you and interact with you for for so many different reasons, and it's not
Yeah.
something you just want to. It's great to feel that sense of like wanting to do something, finding it means
Mhm.
expressing your faith, and it's a very personal thing, and nobody should um, be able to tell you whether something is a good or not a good idea. But you should be able to have that conversation with yourself,
Yeah.
and it's also just like a good way of burning out if you are like, all right, this is my first Ramadan, I'm going to read the entire Quran. And it's like, no, you're not. You're going to maybe get halfway through Al-Baqarah and kind of burn out because you don't you don't know what you're reading. Like you take your time with it, like give everything the patience and the um, deliberate deliberacy that it deserves. You don't have to go all in. You can take your time, like because
Yeah.
it's a kind of an endless journey, and every step is an important step, and you don't have to, run before you can walk. Like,
That's right. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, and
mm,
good things take time and patience,
yeah,
especially something so life-changing and something that I guess creates a new identity in a life, you know? So, yeah, that's definitely some good advice to tell other reverts and your past self as well. So, yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Siobhan and Carrie, for sharing your journey and experiences today. It was very insightful, and I've definitely learned quite a lot today as well. And thank you for those listening to our podcast. I hope it gave you some insight on a queer revert's journey to Islam while navigating through life. And for those listening, if you need any help, you can contact Sydney Queer Muslims on help@sydneyqueermuslims.org.au.